Okay, guys, sorry for the delay. Um, if you're wondering where I am, I'm in North Carolina. A friend of mine's son went missing. He's still missing, and I've been part of an unofficial search party searching for him. He's been gone since Friday, and we have not found him, and the police have not found him. He may be at the bottom of a lake, so we're waiting to see if they turn anything up with the sonar. In any case, that's where I am, and we already had a time crunch, and now we're even more pressed for time because I've been gone. But so I'm gonna try to get moving forward on this material. If you remember, where we left off was with the previous slide, the sea daisies. But just to refresh your memory, we're talking about our first major group of deuterostomate animals, the echinoderms, and we went through a few different classes. Actually, we did not go through a few different classes. I think we just got through Asteroidea. So the next class we're going to move into is Ophiuroidea. But the echinoderms, if you recall, are spiny-skinned deuterostomate creatures that have radial, indeterminate cleavage in terms of development. The embryonic blastopore becomes the animal's anus, and they have enterocoelous coelom formation. And this is true for all of the deuterostomes as far as I know, except for the chordates. The chordates actually, I think if I have it right, return to a more schizocoelous type coelom formation. We are in a big group of animals here called Ambulacraria, and Ambulacraria again consists of the hemichordates and the echinoderms. And the two hemichordate groups that we talked about very briefly, and we'll get to it a little bit later, I think, time permitting, are the terebranchs and the acorn worms. Okay, so the major difference, as a reminder, between the deuterostomate pattern of organization, not embryonically but as adults, is different than the protostomes because the nerve cord, or if they have a nerve cord, is dorsal, and the major blood vessel is ventral to that nerve cord. Of course, the nervous system arrangement of the echinoderms is quite different because as adults they're pentaradial. But remember, they're lumped into the bilateral group of animals because, well, it's thought that some of the creatures that gave rise to them were bilateral and that they have bilateral larvae. So the pentaradial form comes later. And what's even more bizarre about this is that the sea cucumbers have bilateral-like larvae, and then they become kind of radial, pentaradial, but then a sort of bilateral body plan is imposed on that pentaradial form because when they settle to the bottom, one side of them flattens out. And I think I mentioned it's something like a bread loaf. And then Brooke looked at me funny and laughed when I said bread loaf for sea cucumber. Okay, so let's move on to Ophiuroidea. Ophiuroidea means snake tail. And the reason why they're named Ophiuroidea is because each of the arms, and at least the brittle stars, maybe not so much the basket stars, consist of these interlocking ossicles. Maybe interlocking is not exactly the right term, but you get what I'm saying. They articulate, these ossicles articulate with one another, and they almost articulate, at least very superficially, like vertebrae do, and they give the arms a very snake-like appearance when they're moving through the substrate. One of the major differences between Asteroidea and Ophiuroidea is the fact that the arms are set off of the central disk. So if you look at, for instance, the brittle star to your upper left, you can see how clearly distinctive the central disk is from the arms. And in Asteroidea, those arms are continuous with the central disk. I'm sure you remember dissecting it, and you know exactly what I mean. One of the other major differences is that because of the arrangement of the ossicles inside the arms, the ambulacral groove is closed. It doesn't have that archway that the sea stars have on the aboral surface of the arms. I'm sorry, the oral surface of the arms. So Ophiuroidea consists of brittle stars and basket stars, and in the brittle stars the arms again are snake-like, but if you contrast that with the basket star that's down below here, you can see that the arms branch repeatedly. So in both of these cases, the arms are used for locomotion almost exclusively, and feeding, sweeping through the substrate and collecting debris and moving it to the mouth on the lower surface, right? But the tube feet here aren't used in locomotion. The tube feet here are used in gas exchange and are used in feeding. One of the other differences between Ophiuroidea and Asteroidea is that there's no Bipinaria and Brachiolaria larvae in Ophiuroidea. They have a larval type that's referred to as Ophioplutus larva, and that's the lower right-hand image here. A couple other differences include the fact that these things have no dermal branchia, no pedicellaria, and they don't have suction cups associated with the tube feet. So if you remember, in Asteroidea there's ampullary muscles that force water down to the bottom of the tube foot, and it causes the tube foot to kind of evaginate. And then when the muscles around the ampulla relax, water moves from the bottom of the tube foot up toward the top, and that creates an invagination of the bottom of the tube foot, which creates that powerful suction. Well, Ophiuroidans don't have this, and they're basically using the tube feet on the arms as they sweep the arms through whatever substrate they're in to catch the particulates and whatever prey they're eating, and that together, I think, with some cilia, moves the food to the mouth. They are capable of internal brooding, and we discussed briefly what that means. And they also have bursa, which are soft membranes inside little slits in the arm that allow for waste material to be taken out of the animal. So on page, I think it's on, let me look here. On page 308, figure 16.9, you can see where the bursal slits are on the oral surface of the arms. The other thing is that they have an oral madreporite instead of the aboral madreporite, and If you recall, the madreporite or the sieve plate in the sea star is what is used to bring water into their water vascular system. Okay, so we used to go to the invertebrate house at the zoo and see some of these animals, and we would get a better appreciation for exactly how sort of dynamic and interesting they are, and kind of how bizarre they are. When most people think of animals, well, they're probably thinking of some vertebrate, but even though these things are not vertebrates, they're relatively closely related to the vertebrates, yet as adults they're so much different. So what I suggest you do is probably just maybe Google image, or even go on YouTube and put Ophiuroidea in there, and you can see what it looks like when they eat and how they move. And I also have a hyperlink on this slide. It's on where it says ossicles for snake-like movement. It's not highlighted from where I'm sitting right now, but you probably see it as yellow. It says movement. Maybe just click on that. It's kind of underwhelming, but you get the idea. Class Echinoidea consists of the sea urchins, the hard urchins, and the sand dollars. Echinoidea means like spiny form, and the sea urchins and the sand dollars, at least superficially, are pretty dissimilar, right? The sand dollars are flattened out, and they don't appear to be spiny like the sea urchins. Same thing with the hard urchins and the sand dollars. But internally, there's quite a few similarities in terms of how the digestive organs are organized, and in terms of how the water vascular system is organized. So in spite of the fact that they look superficially dissimilar, the internal similarities, and of course the genetic material, make them quite similar, so they're in the same class. You can find these things distributed in all different types of marine habitats. The sea urchins like harder substrates, like rocks and corals, and they use those spines to wedge themselves in between crevices in rocks and corals, and they can stay protected within those crevices. In some cases, the spines on the sea urchins are venomous, and if you step on one, it can be quite painful. The sand dollars and the hard urchins like sandy or muddy substrates, and they, of course, certainly in the case of the sand dollars, like to burrow. The sand dollars live in dense beds, and the fact that they live in dense beds helps them reproduce and feed. They use their tube feet for catching organic matter and moving that organic matter to the mouth. And in the next slide, there's a link to a video where you can see a sand dollar doing just that. But when you click on those links, mute your speakers, because the music that accompanies those videos is terrible. I don't know why people ruin these videos, these great videos, with this terrible music, but whatever. Okay, what else do I want to say about these things? I think that's it for now. Let's move on to the next slide. So most of you have seen sand dollar tests, that is the skeleton of the sand dollars washed up on the beach. Some of you, if you've been lucky enough, have probably seen some of these things alive and moving through the sand. I mostly see dead sand dollars when I'm visiting the shore, but this last spring break I was fortunate enough to see a bed of of live ones in coastal Georgia, and I took this picture with my phone. But you can see the tube feet that are around the edge of the animal, and these tube feet were moving quite actively, so it was really obvious that these things were alive. And when I picked them up and put them down, they immediately started to burrow. But you can see there's tube feet in these openings in the test that are, I guess, perpendicular to the edge of the animal, and there are tube feet again all along the edge of the animal. And there's also a whole pile of soft, almost membranous structures on the aboral surface that are always moving around, presumably cleaning the animal of debris and helping water flow where it's supposed to go. But underneath the animal there are food grooves, and you'll see the food grooves in the video link on right up there on your right. But they're moving through the sand, moving particulates just like the other echinoderms do, down the food grooves and into the mouth. So this is a cross-section, I guess it's a cross-section, from aboral to oral end of the animal here. And you can see that this obviously is a sea urchin, and the sea urchin has a big body cavity here, a big coelom, and it's not as compressed as the sand dollar. But again, much of the structures are similar in terms of how they're arranged internally. If you want, you can check out some dissections of these. Oftentimes people will dissect sea urchins and sand dollars in the same lab, and you can see the similarities between the two on YouTube if you're interested internally. But let's look at this image. What you can see is that there is an aboral anus, an aboral madreporite. The gonopore is aboral, and the tube feet are extending through pores in the test, and that hooks up with the water vascular system, just like we've seen in the other echinoderms, right? So you can see the madreporite, you can see the stone canal, you can see the ring canal, you can see the radial canals, you can see all that same stuff, just arranged a little bit differently here. Now, they have spines. The urchins have spines, and these spines may fit into sort of a socket, and they might be mobile. Well, they are mobile. And some of these are hollowed out, and some of these are venomous. And some people who've stepped on these things experience quite a bit of pain and swelling associated with the puncture wound caused by these spines. They have pedicellaria, and the pedicellaria helps them keep debris off of different regions of the animal. And down at the oral end, what we haven't talked about before are these roughened teeth. And both the sea urchins and the sand dollars have these teeth. So next time you pick up a test of a sand dollar, shake it around and see if you can hear any of the teeth internally rattling around. But around the mouth are gills, and they also are equipped with a structure called the Aristotle's lantern. And the Aristotle's lantern is composed of a series of 35 ossicles and specialized muscles, and it creates this little chewing or pinching structure that they use to burrow or grind into rock or escape predators. And they Rob Aguilar at the Smithsonian, who you met, has some pretty good pictures of some of these animals and the Aristotle's lanter on his Flickr site. Okay, they use their tube feet and gill to promote gas exchange, and I think that's about all I want to say about. Oh no, what I do want to say is that this is a cross section, right? So you can't see the pendial symmetry in it, but you can see the plates. I think they're kind of pinkish colored here. They have pentaradial symmetry, and basically those tube feet are projecting from spaces between the different plates of the animal. The sea cucumbers are pretty well known for their ability to eviscerate. So, as we'll see in a couple of slides, if these things are attacked, they can fire out from the body respiratory trees which are full of toxic substances that are unpalatable to animals, and that's their defensive mechanism. They can then regenerate these respiratory trees. But the sea cucumbers are found at all depths and in all oceans, and they make their way over hard substrates, or they can burrow. They don't have arms, and they are, again, elongated, sort of worm-like creatures that are elongated along the oral-aboral axis. And underneath the animal, I guess I guess we can call it the ventral surface for now, is kind of flattened. So again, it's a bilateral creature with a pentaradial form that has secondarily returned to a kind of bilateral appearance. Strange. The body wall is pretty thick and it's muscular. They don't have protruding spines and they don't have pedicellaria. The dermis is the thick layer of connective tissue that is embedded with ossicles, and they have different types of ossicles. Some are tiny and others are big, and those ossicles don't really determine their body shape or how they move, but there's one important set of ossicles that we'll discuss in 2 slides. They have circular muscle that overlies longitudinal muscle, and that gives them almost a worm-like locomotory wave when they move. Most of these are relatively sluggish burrowers that move around or swim by undulating. The sea cucumbers use those tentacles up top to ingest particulate organic matter. The mucus covering the tentacles traps food, and then I'm assuming cilia associated with those tentacles moves the food into the mouth of the animal. Fertilization is mostly external. They have planktonic larvae that metamorphose and settle into a sea cucumber. Some of these species engage in, they have brooding, and females will then trap eggs when they're released, and once they're fertilized, they're transferred to specialized regions of the body surface where they're brooded. After this, once development is sufficient enough, the body wall will rupture and the young are released. Fission can occur, and they can regenerate. Okay, so let's look at the external the internal features of the sea cucumber here. What you notice is that we have, again, a ring canal. There's the familiar Palaean vesicles that we saw in Asteroidea earlier on. Internal ossicles here, the calcareous ring, support the tentacles and the ring canal. They have a long looped intestine. This intestine obviously terminates at the anus. But what's also continuous with at least the rectum here is the respiratory tree on both the left and the right side. And these respiratory trees can be filled with water and through a bunch of modifications sent out of the anus, and they contain nitrogenous wastes and sticky secretions and toxins, and typically things that are biting onto sea cucumbers don't like that. It seems pretty inefficient to lose the very structures that you're using to exchange gases with, but they can regenerate them relatively quickly if they're lost. So again, back up to that calcareous ring. It's a supportive structure, and it has longitudinal muscles attached to it so they can bring in the tentacles. All right, I think that's all I want to say about here. Okay, down to your lower right, there's a hyperlink on evisceration. You can see the diver poking the sea cucumber and then, being all insensitive about it, laughs at the poor thing. So let's move into class Crinoidea. The picture on the slide depicts a feather star, and you can see that there's highly branched arms that are used in suspension feeding. In this case, the oral end is up. For all of the other echinoderms, the oral end is pointed downward. These are considered to be the most primitive of the living echinoderms. And so biologists hypothesized that suspension feeding was actually the first use of the appendages and the tube feet, and that tube feet were then secondarily modified to support locomotion. So these things use the arms and kind of wave those arms through the water column to pull suspended matter out of the water column, and then they use cilia and tube feet to move food along that ambulacral groove right to the mouth. Down at the lower end of the animal's, I guess, aboral surface, you can see thinner yellow structures wrapped around what appears to be a coral, right? So let me silence my phone. Those structures are called cirri, and the cirri grip onto the substrate. So these things, for all intents and purposes, are kind of sessile animals. Other species will release a biochemical and kind of fuse to whatever their substrate of interest is, and they'll suspension feed from there. But these can release themselves and use the arms to find a new substrate to attach to using the cirri. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Let's have a look at the external anatomy of the sea lily here. The crown is really the oral end of the animal. Both the mouth and the anus are obviously, the mouth obviously is on the oral end. The arms have structures that radiate off of them called pinnules, and these support tube feet. There's double rows in each arm, and the ambulacral grooves lead to the mouth, as I mentioned before. But what's supporting the arms and the pinnules is a set of ossicles that make up a supportive calyx. The calyx connects to a stalk, and the stalk contains a bunch of disc-like ossicles that form these sort of joints that enable a little bit of mobility in the animal. As I mentioned before, the sea lilies are permanently attached to whatever substrate they're attached to support suspension feeding, whereas the feather stars are not. Reproduction is similar to reproductions in some of the other groups. They're primarily dioecious, but as with all slower moving or sessile animals, well, most slower moving or sessile animals, the monoecious condition is present, and if they are monoecious, they're protandrous. So the hemichordates are our next ambulacrarian group, and what you can see here over to your right is actually an acorn worm. You can see the proboscis, the collar, and the trunk. And you can see some of the extensions of the posterior body that are, I think, used for gas exchange. These are marine deuterostomate animals, and as you can see again in the picture to your right, they have a body that's divided into the proboscis, the collar, and the trunk. And they have also a three-part coelom that corresponds with that organization. They have ciliated pharyngeal slits, and incidentally, we have pharyngeal slits when we're developing. They have an open circulatory system, a complete one-way digestive tract, and a dorsal, sometimes tubular nerve cord. Now 5, the nerve cord, and 2 are characteristics that are important to remember, because when we get to the chordates, those are 2 very important chordate characteristics, and these are in part why these things are so close together phylogenetically. The hemichordates consist of, again, more worms. I know you guys love worms, but the acorn worms and the terebranchs. The acorn worms are in class Enteropneusta. You can see in the picture to your right, the actual acorn part of this is the proboscis, and it's extended a bit more here. It uses that proboscis to acquire food, and its mouth lies in that groove right between the proboscis and the collar. We'll look at that on the next slide. But these are marine, intertidal, vermiform, deuterostomate creatures. And they're interstitial, living in the mud, right? They construct U-shaped burrows, and obviously they're named acorn worms because of the shape of the proboscis. Let's look at its anatomy in the next slide. So in this slide you can see the tripartite body cavity, and the tripartite body cavity again is enterocoelous. A lot of the deuterostomes have enterocoelous coelom formation, but it's not the case for the chordates. I'm sorry, it's not the case for the vertebrates. If you look up at the proboscis, inside of the proboscis is a structure called the glomerulus. And we have a glomerulus in our kidney, and that glomerulus is essentially a filter. So the Enteropneus, the acorn worm, is using that glomerulus to filter waste material from their blood. They have dorsal and ventral contractile vessels that deliver blood to blood sinuses in the body. Remember, they have an open circulatory system, so the blood is leaving those blood vessels. However, that dorsal nerve cord is superior to the dorsalmost contractile vessel, and that organization is similar to ours. They have widely distributed unspecialized sensor receptors, and most of what they're relying for gas exchange is diffusion across the body wall and pharyngeal slits. I think those extensions at the posterior end of the animal, a few slides back, were increasing surface area for some of those exchanges to occur. They use their proboscis in feeding, as I mentioned before, and the proboscis is working in conjunction with mucus and ciliary motion to trap food and transport food to the mouth. And if I remember correctly, that fold of the collar just posterior to the mouth is working like a labial palp in the mollusk, and it's moving food that's probably inedible or too big or whatever away from the mouth so it doesn't get clogged up. Enteropneustes are dioecious. Gonads are positioned anteriorly in the trunk, and fertilization is external. What they produce is a ciliated Tornaria larva. Now, what's important to note is the position of those ciliated tracts on the Tornaria larva. How they form and where they form is regulated by genes that in the chordates regulate the position of the dorsal nerve cord in the body. So it's thought that some type of mutation to those regulatory genes may have been involved in the evolution of the chordates. Once these things develop, they'll metamorphose, settle, and become an adult on the sea floor. The terebranchs are marine worms that live in deep ocean waters of the southern hemisphere. They live in these tubes that they secrete, and each individual in a tube is called a zooid. And they have, you can see these elongated arms that bear tentacles, and they have a shield-like proboscis that they use to navigate inside the tubes. They have this elongated stalk, and these stalks can join together and they can reproduce asexually to form colonies. They are dioecious creatures when they produce sexually, and they have a larva that looks kind of like a planula larva that's free swimming that will eventually settle and metamorphose into these tube worms. Let's just review these groups once more. So within the animal kingdom here, we have some major groups. Way back, we have our basal phyla. Then we have our Lophotrochozoa and our Ecdysozoa. The Lophotrochozoa and the Ecdysozoa are both considered to be protostomes. The deuterostomes consist of a couple of major groups. Of course, we have Ambulacraria, which consists of the echinoderms and the hemichordates and the chordates. And there's three subphyla of the chordates. We haven't gotten into that yet, but we will very shortly. Most of what people think of when they think of animals are obviously chordates, right? But if you open up your textbook to that inside front cover, you'll see most of what exists in the animal kingdom are not chordates. Okay, and in fact, what most people think of when they think of animals are vertebrates. And obviously, not all chordates are vertebrates. Anyway, within the echinoderms, phylum Echinodermata, that's what we just covered. We started out last week mostly talking about Asteroidea. Okay, Asteroidea consists of the familiar sea stars and, of course, the less familiar sea daisies. Ophiuroidea, those are our basket stars and our brittle stars. Echinoidea, sand dollars, sea urchins and heart urchins, and of course Holothuroidea, the sea cucumbers. The most primitive living or extant members of Echinodermata are the crinoids, the sea lilies, and the feather stars. We'll get into the hemichordates next, but if you remember, very briefly, those are parabranchs, these deuterostomate worms that have some of the chordate characteristics, but not very many of them. The parabranchs have a shield-like proboscis and tentacles, and they live in tests or tubes that they secrete. Enteropneusτα, those are the acorn worms, and they have, well, when it's retracted, an acorn-shaped proboscis, another deuterostomate worm that we'll discuss, well, in the next unit. Okay, so this should wrap up Echinodermata. We mentioned what the other part of Ambulacraria is, the hemichordates, and in the next unit, when we talk about hemichordates and cephalochordates and urochordates, you'll get to see some images of these things. Well, you can get to see some if you just crack open the textbook too. All right. Just to reiterate, what unites the ambulacrarians are the fact that they have larval similarities that both move and feed with ciliated bands. Again, the control of the development of those bands genetically is important to know about, because that could have influenced where the chordates came from. Molecular studies and studies of their development indicate that they're closely related. Additionally, the ties between Ambulacraria and Chordata are pretty well established. The fact that some, but not all, of the chordates have enterocoelom formation, radiocleavage. Of course, anus developing from the embryonic blastopore links them together, and then there's a whole pile of molecular evidence that supports the developmental evidence. Okay? So the significance in that Tornaria-like larva will become apparent when we talk about hypotheses on chordate evolution in the next unit. Okay, I'm sure you're sleeping by now.